Hello everyone, Ember here, and welcome back to a new video. In this one I'm going to be going over my tier list for the Obsidian Flames format /151, although admittedly I'll probably be leaving out a bunch of decks from 151 as a set. Obviously this tier list is very subjective, like most tier lists. Of course, what would be the point in different YouTubers doing a tier list at that point, if we all have the same ideas and opinions? But of course, if you disagree with anything, or maybe you happen to agree with something, then please do let me know down below. But yeah, just getting into the tier list, I've kind of organized these by S, A, B, C, D, and then E. E is kind of just like only play these decks if you really, really want to. I think D tier is kind of like sort of on the fringes. Maybe they need something in the future to be better, but they're kind of just, chilling in D tier. Nothing too crazy. C tier, I think these are like the perfect tier 2 decks, really, is C tier. They're kind of rogue on the fringe stuff. Yeah, they could maybe break into the top tables, but realistically, I don't think C tier decks are going to be doing anything too crazy. As for B tier decks, I think B tier is kind of like your tier 1.5 maybe. I guess these would be like tier 2 decks for tier 2 decks for like most other YouTubers. So I guess we'll also like be dividing them up a bit because there is a certain point in B tier where it becomes like more tier 2 anyway. And then A tier is what I expect to be doing consistently really well at major events. And then S tier, I think, are the best decks in the format. So in reverse to that order, I guess we'll start with S tier. So I have Lost Zone and Giratina. Also, just a very quick heads up, I probably won't be going over every single deck in this video because it'll just take forever, but I will be going over most of the ones that I think are worth talking about. But basically in S tier, I think Lost Zone, as well as the Arctina variant of Giratina, I still think these decks are both S tier. I still think they both have the kind of power that they need to compete. Lost Zone, I think, is a bit weaker due to just the popularity of Iona, really. But aside from that, I still think Lost Zone packs a large enough punch to do really well in Standard. I know it kind of underperformed a little bit at the World Championship, but still moving into the Obsidian Flames format, I think Lost Zone will be pretty strong. So Lost Zone, clear S tier for me. Arctina is a bit of a strange one because I think a lot of players would just naturally put this in A tier, but not any higher. I personally think Arctina is an S tier deck just because it has the power and consistency that a Lost Zone Giratina list would have, but also has the consistency and the utility offered by an Arceus. So that's just my honest thoughts. Feel free to disagree with that, but I thought it was a bit of a stronger variant than Lost Zone Giratina was. As for A tier, though, I have God of War in the top of A tier because I still think it packs a punch. Yes, Charizard from Obsidian Flames does kind of dethrone God of War a little bit, but we've seen most decks survive in the format when they have big weaknesses on their back, like massive targets. So I do think God of War will eventually wither out the Charizard storm. Also worth mentioning that I don't think Charizard is actually super competitive. It is the top of B tier in this list, but it is early days, and I think Charizard could honestly fall in favor of, more consistent top tier decks. But yeah, that's God of War in A tier. Then we have Lost Zone Giratina, which honestly didn't really do a whole lot post-rotation, at least immediately, but then moving away from the Paldea Evolved format and into the Worlds format, this deck got super, super popular and was like the deck to beat at Worlds, basically. And of course, it wasn't in the top two, but this deck is still very strong, and it's easy to see why. Giratina obviously packs so much of a punch. However, it is sometimes a two-prize liability in games that you start Giratina V and such, so there is some issues with this deck. Is it a bad deck by any means? Absolutely not. Will it be better in the future? Probably yes, when we get these extra tanky two prize Paradox Pokemon especially. I do think Giratina will be very useful in that sense with Star Requiem. But either way, not the best deck, certainly not the worst. Then we have Mew VMAX, which, for the deck that just won the World Championships, it may seem a bit strange to put it in essentially 5th place here. But I do have Mew in A tier because I still think it's hurt a bit by Charizard just existing, really. But once Charizard, falls down the wayside and no longer becomes flavor of the month and maybe starts to underperform a bit more in online events, then I do think Mew VMAX will have a chance to just kind of regain that popularity that it did pre-Obsidian Flames. And therefore, I don't think Mew VMAX is really going anywhere. Also, Mew VMAX can kind of just beat a lot of other decks just by being quicker, so That's why I have my VMAX still at the top. Also in A tier is actually Lugia, which is the only other deck, really, I think, in Standard that kind of falls into these top 6 decks. It's these 6 decks that kind of tend to dominate most online events, and it's really easy to see why when you think about it long enough, because these are just the most powerful decks that we have in Standard, really. Every other deck you can make a decent argument for. I've seen a lot of people say that stuff like Chen Pao and even Miraidon are super underrated right now. But me personally, I think these 6 decks are the ones that you have to be always preparing for when going into a major event. So yeah, definitely these 6 are the top decks, especially with Lugia V-Star, because honestly, I still think Lugia V-Star is a highly consistent deck. Is it like crazy strong? Maybe not. Like obviously, it lost a lot to rotation, I should say. Definitely lost a lot of power by losing Aurora energy and such. But I still don't think Lugia V Star is a bad deck by any means. As for B tier, though, I'll quickly go over some of these that I think are the more interesting ones. Of course, Charizard at the top there. Also got a Pidgeot Arceus deck. I personally don't think this deck is terrible, but no one's really done anything with this concept yet. I still think it could be really cool with like Charon's Care loops and such, but again, not really seeing anything too crazy about it. Gem Pal was another super popular deck in the Paldea Evolved format, but honestly, this deck is not really underperforming as such, but it's kind of just not really doing a whole lot at the top tables. So that's kind of like why it's still in B tier for me. Arceus Pikachu, this is definitely a deck that probably could be like bumped down to C tier or maybe even lower now. It's just like nothing too crazy. It's a pretty decent counter deck, I should say, but it's just like, yeah, it's just not what it once was. It's definitely not the World Champions list that, doesn't have that same kind of power in the format. Maybe if we see a load of Paradox Pokemon that are super competitive, maybe Flying Pikachu can become relevant again. But right now, I'm definitely not holding my breath for this deck, which is a shame because it is a fun deck, but sadly nothing too crazy. Next up, though, is we have Miraidon. A lot of players really like Miraidon, and for good reason. It does have a lot of speed and power, but unfortunately, the deck does struggle a bit with getting key KOs at certain points in the game. You're expending all these resources just to effectively do like 220, 250 sometimes if you have Regieleki in play. But unfortunately, that's obviously not enough to deal with some of the more tankier Pokemon. Then, of course, stuff like Charizard can very easily carry you in return, which is a massive pain. Lugia as well, even though you're hitting them for weakness. So honestly, I don't think Miraidon is anything super crazy. I think with some more lightning support, it could be really, really good. But as of right now, I don't think this deck is anything crazy. Stuff like Urshifu, I think is whatever personally. I don't rate this deck very highly, but I know players who play this deck a lot say it's really good, and that's understandable. It is like more of a high skill ceiling deck, in my opinion, but that's just my thoughts, honestly. But the deck isn't terrible by any stretch of imagination, so that's why it's still in B tier. Blastoise, honestly, is like, I think, in my opinion, like the only new relevant, like competitive deck to come out of 151, really. So I did struck Blastoise in B tier here. I think it could be really good with Chen Pao. It's a very, very tanky Pokemon, effectively having 360 HP. But aside from that, nothing too crazy from Blastoise. Has one hit KO power, has amazing tanking capabilities, and against stuff like Charizard, that just seems really, really good, as well as against stuff like Gardevoir. But it is a stage 2 at the end of the day, which is why a lot of people probably have some serious reservations with Blastoise, and rightfully so, until proven otherwise. Next up, though, is we have Dialga Magenzone, which honestly, Dialga hasn't done a whole lot this format. This deck received a decent amount of hype when it got like top 16 at that one event, and it hasn't really done anything ever since then. But it still remains one of the cooler decks in the format, and I couldn't resist putting it high up because, of course, if this is the kind of deck that if it got any more improvements in the future, like any more metal type support, for example, it could just be really, really strong because, of course, that extra turn is just so huge in most games. So Dialga kind of had to be a B tier deck. Next up, though, is we have Darkrai Arbok, which is a bit of a strange choice. I can see a lot of people saying, like, you always scoundrel Darkrai base. Like, you always say that Darkrai is a C tier deck. What's he doing in B tier? Well, I do think Arbok helps Darkrai a lot, especially in the Lost Zone matchup. So, like, Arbok could be really disruptive. Is it going to push Darkrai over the edge? I personally don't think so. Maybe this deck will eventually be tier 1 when we finally get Roaring Moon, I should say. But right now, I don't think Darkrai Arbok will be a very, very competitive deck. Still a B tier deck in my opinion, but yeah, just my opinion. Lastly, we've got Regigigas. This is not copium, I swear. I swear Regigigas is a lot better than people think it is, but until proven otherwise, of course, straight to B tier it goes. It has been doing decently well in Asian tournaments, but really that doesn't translate well to the West always. And of course, Regigigas just hasn't really done a lot. So I can't say for sure that Regigigas is what it once was. It's certainly not a top 10 deck or anything anymore. But yeah, still B tier in my opinion, but that's just my thoughts on Regigigas. As for C tier, I like loosely, yeah, I think that's the word, loosely brush over some of these, some ones that I think could pop up eventually, but don't quite have what it takes right now. Stuff like Gudra Lost Zone, actually, I think could be really solid in the future, just because Gudra really excels in formats where we don't really know what's going on. So just playing something pretty straightforward and consistent as Gudra makes a lot of sense to me personally. I initially had like Arceus Gudra on this tier list, but removed it because just no one is playing Arceus Gudra, despite it seeing a ton of play in Japan at one point. But yeah, I could definitely see Gudra coming back, just the minus 80, super annoying in a lot of matchups. Definitely nullifies stuff like Arceus quite a bit, which I think is important because Arceus decks are definitely coming back into favor a lot more in this format. So, Gudra could become super relevant in that sense. But aside from that, nothing too crazy there. United Wings is like a single price. I know I've kind of like skimmed over Regidrago and Ting Lu there, but yeah, those decks, there's nothing really else to say about them. They're kind of just C tier decks. Can't really say they're going to improve really without seeing new buffs. But yeah, as for United Wings, I don't think this deck is doing anything crazy until Lost Zone rotates, unfortunately. Maybe we'll get like a basic Pokemon that can prevent all damage counters from being placed on your Pokemon. That'd be super cool. But sadly, I don't think United Wings is doing anything crazy. Wigglytuff could be the next big tanking deck from 151. Better than Oinkologne, honestly, which is a bit sad because I really like Oinkologne, was rooting for him. But I think Wigglytuff does have like some solid potential. Requiring two different energies is a bit annoying, but Wigglytuff can be a lot tankier than Oinkologne, which is huge in certain matchups. So I do like the look of Wigglytuff. Zoroark box, unfortunately, I'm just going to dump in C tier. Even with all the new buffs, even with stuff like Titan, Reverse Energy, the new Toad Scroll to prevent Sableye, I just think Zoroark is just an inconsistent mess, really. At the end of the day, I do like this deck a lot. I still play it sometimes, especially for daily challenges, wherever I can, really. But unfortunately, this deck, we have to face facts at this point. Zoroark is just nothing too crazy. It's kind of like the single price deck that everyone's always rooting for because it's so cool. But sadly, it's just not really going to be doing anything in the standard format, at least in my opinion. Hopefully I'm wrong. Maybe Lost Zone spikes in popularity and we never see Lost Zone again, and then all of a sudden Zoroark can take over. But until that day comes, unfortunately, Zoroark, I'm just going to have to dump it in C tier. Oinkologne is in a similar position. It's not quite tanky and annoying enough to be considered great. Also, I didn't put Glimmora on this tier list for whatever reason, so I would also put Glimmora here, like Glimmora EX, I should say. So yeah, Oinkologne and Glimmora, not as really annoying enough and tanky enough to be able to cope with the top tier decks, and there's just better cheese decks and stuff. So yeah, don't think too much of Oinkologne. Snorlax Charm, which honestly gained like Tapu Bulu, so it can now deal with Charizard and stuff. So I don't think that deck is terrible for a budget deck, especially. I think it's really, really solid. But unfortunately, against stuff like Lost Zone, it's not going to be doing super well. And of course, decks that have really decent single prize options, like Lugia has them sometimes. Lost Zone can have them in the form of stuff like the Zamazenta. So Charm Snorlax, nothing too crazy, but at the end of the day, a pretty solid budget deck nonetheless. Hisuian Zoroark V-Star, which really hasn't done anything at all. I think a lot of people expected this deck to at least win several tournaments or do pretty well at some major events, but yeah, Hisuian Zoroark really hasn't done anything too crazy. Toadscroll EX, I'm going to be brutally honest with you guys. I don't have any faith in this deck whatsoever. After a few games, it seems okay, but there was that bug glitch thing where you counted Toadscroll's damage, and that was super annoying on TCG Live, so not a lot of players have been really trying out Toadscroll. But honestly, even that glitch aside, the deck just feels way too slow and clunky to get anything done. I've been trying without Eldegoss, and that seems to be a lot better, but honestly, I don't have high hopes for Toadscroll in the future. Next up, though, is we have Tyranitar, Vespiquen, Alakazam. I'll all lump into the same tier, I guess. Vespiquen, I think, is the worst of these three, personally, even though it's not the bottom there. Alakazam is, just because we haven't really seen enough of Alakazam in Japan to know what it's capable of. But yeah, I don't think Vespiquen is very consistent. It seems to be pretty strong when against setup, but of course, it just has to get set up to get to that point. So, I don't think Vespiquen is just, it's just too inconsistent and too clunky to really do anything right now in the format, which is a bit of a shame. Trinitar, I think, is in a similar position until we get something like Dodrio maybe in 151. Then maybe Trinitar could be a lot better. But as of right now, I don't think this deck is anything crazy. It is very fun. It can get you some fun wins, and I do enjoy playing it a lot. But unfortunately, I don't think Trinitar will be anything more than a C tier deck. Same goes for Alakazam, unfortunately. Super cool card, but nothing too crazy. As for D tier and E tier, I'm just going to summarize my thoughts as followed. Basically, I think that these decks could all be decent in their own right, especially in the right matchups, of course. Stuff like Meowscarada and funny enough Venusaur as well, actually. Hit weakness on Charizard, but of course, if Charizard just runs a fire type attacker, then that's, obviously terrible. Stuff like the Skeledirge is okay, tosses out enough damage. Rotom V-Star sees a lot of fringe play online, pretty solid deck overall, but nothing too crazy in terms of online results. Kyurem and Varum are just like, or Revroom, I should say. They're more like meme decks, really, at the end of the day. All these decks, I think, could be better in the future, maybe, with certain upgrades, but as it stands right now, I just don't think any of these decks are that crazy. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Is there any placements you would change on this tier list? It's been a very wishy-washy video, I understand that. All my opinions just all over the place. But yeah, let me know what you think down below, and thank you for watching.